and an opponent of the Constitution who was at the Constitutional Convention. His wife published his notes after his death, and that's what we know about essentially what went on. And so, yeah, I've heard the same thing for a long time, but who knows what, it sort of made sense. Jefferson called, in a letter to James Madison, he referred to Hamilton as a political colossus. He was brilliant, he was a workaholic, he was devious, Machiavellian, and an inveterate statist, always and everywhere wanting to grow the government, raise taxes, hang tax protesters, invade France. And so Jefferson saw him as the potential mortal enemy of freedom. And so it wouldn't be at all surprising that he might have personally had something to do with that. But Jefferson himself wasn't at the Constitutional Convention, but the Jeffersonians might have had, but I can't tell you.
Hi. To what extent do you think, well, if any extent really, Hamilton recognized the role of economic stability in establishing the legitimacy of a developing country? The government of a developing country.
Recognize what was the first part?
The role of economic stability in establishing the legitimacy of a government in a developing country.
Well, sure, they all wanted stable economic growth. But one of the things, this great debate between Jefferson and Hamilton, much of it is about economics. Most people who read about this from the history books, well, the history books are written by historians who don't know much or if anything about economics, so they tend to downplay the economic angle of it. But Jefferson has been given a very bad rap by the historians. For example, they'll say that he was against banks. He wasn't. He was against a government-run bank run by politicians. And they'll also say that Jefferson was against manufacturing and he advocated an agrarian society. Well, yeah, he advocated agrarian society. He was a farmer, and as most Americans were at the time. But he wasn't against manufacturing. He was against taxing farmers and using the money to subsidize manufacturers. That's what he was against. He was against that, and he thought that would lead to corruption and instability. And he was against the government bank because he and his followers thought the government bank would, one, corrupt politics because politicians, they didn't trust politicians to not use some of that money to influence politics. And also they thought it would lead to instability, economic instability, which it did. They observed it. The first 5 years of the Bank of the United States proved them correct. In fact, by the time you get to Andrew Jackson's time in the late 1820s, the Bank of the United States proved Jackson right absolutely about the political corruption created by the bank, because they were literally financing the campaigns of the opponents of Andrew Jackson, literally using bank money from the Bank of the United States. That'd be like the Fed financing John McCain's campaign, but not Barack Obama's campaign. It's just rotten politics involved. And so as far as stability, Jefferson saw all these things as destabilizing: the bank, subsidies to corporations, protectionist tariffs. And so I wouldn't give Hamilton credit for that. I blame him for being wrong on economics. That's the main thing. I think his biggest failing on economics was he failed to take seriously Adam Smith's ideas. Another lie that is told about Jefferson and Hamilton is that Hamilton, since he grew up as a teenager working for British slave owners in the West Indies, he supposedly was a genius on economics. He knew a lot about economics because he worked for the British slave owners who had slaves shipping molasses from the West Indies to Europe. Well, you can be the best French fry salesman on the planet and still not know a darn thing about economics. That's fine. You don't have to know a darn thing about economic theory and international trade. All you have to know about how to sell French fries. But it was Jefferson who really understood the economics of his day. He had read very carefully and understood Adam Smith, Turgot. If you go to Monticello tomorrow, there's a bust of Turgot, the French finance minister, in the front entrance of there. He knew David. He knew of the works of all the French physiocrats and so on and so forth. Hamilton didn't know any of this. In fact, the way in which Hamilton got the job of Treasury Secretary, you can read about it in Ron Chernow's biography. He knew nothing about finance or economics by his own admission. The Revolutionary War was coming to an end, he wrote a letter to Robert Morris, who's known as the financier of the American Revolution, very wealthy man who pledged his own credit to borrow money to help finance the army during the American Revolution. He wrote a letter to Robert Morris, which is a real kiss-up letter, pretty much saying, a 30-page letter saying, I agree with everything you say about economics, about protectionist tariffs, about the need for a central bank, and so forth. And in order to write the letter, he recruited Timothy Pickering, who would be George Washington's Secretary of War, who was known to know something about economics. So Pickering sort of gave him crib notes that he used to write this 30-page letter to really just kiss up to Robert Morris. And so, and he must have been very good at it because he was George Washington's aide as a very young man. He must have had a real talent for kissing up. And he was highly intelligent. You know, he was a hero of the American Revolution militarily and all that. But then the way he got the job as Treasury Secretary is Robert Morris. He was the father of the original Bank of North America, which is really the precursor of the Fed. It went bust. But Morris wanted a government bank like the Bank of England to finance and subsidize his businesses and the businesses of his business associates. And so Robert Morris, wrote to George Washington after the war, when Washington became president, recommending Alexander Hamilton as Treasury Secretary, who would be his puppet, be Morris's puppet. And in Cherno's book, Cherno writes that George Washington turned to Alexander Hamilton and said, I didn't know you knew anything about finance. We never talked about it. But he appointed him Treasury Secretary simply on the word of Robert Morris, because Robert Morris was a major financier of George Washington's army, and he knew all about business and finance. George Washington was a businessman too, and he must have respected Morris a great deal. And so that's how that came about. Yes, yes sir. What's that?
Do you know of any European financiers that might have been backing Hamilton and supporting him?
I don't know. There might have been. I know his political center was the New York, New England business and banking community. That's the chambers of commerce in the North. That's who the financial spine of the Federalist Party was. And Hamilton was, he was sort of the intellectual guru. He was quite like a guru, too. He was, maybe some of you have seen that, The Love Guru. Did you ever see that movie? It was not too long ago. Hamilton must have been a sort of a guru. Even John Marshall, the Chief Justice of the United States, if you read about what he said about Hamilton, it sounds like a teenage girl talking about her first boyfriend. It's just slobbering praise over Hamilton's genius, because Hamilton taught him, Marshall, how to subvert the Constitution. He says how to rewrite the Constitution to get a much bigger government, which Marshall was a big fan of. And so in the same, I quote William Graham Sumner as saying that Hamilton's report on manufacturers taught generations of politicians how to advocate for corporate welfare financed by central banking and protectionist tariffs. He laid out the legalistic arguments and political arguments for it. Yes, sir, the guy in the white shirt.
I'm Professor DiLorenzo. In the Obama-McCain race, we heard nothing about the Federal Reserve apart from, Ron Paul earlier. And as a teacher of history, in reading your essays and books, I've learned that, the national bank and mercantilism was the biggest issue there was through Jackson's fights and even, what Lincoln was all about. How have we descended to the point where the elites behind the Federal Reserve have shut out this topic of discussion? No one knows about the Federal Reserve. It's confusing. It never gets discussed, as Ron Paul does, tries to discuss it. What do you think about that? The biggest issue at the beginning and nothing now.
Well, it is confusing. Murray Rothbard, one of his books is called The Mystery of Banking. It's kind of a mysterious business, I suppose. Well, I think it's just in general, America.